Support for today's episode comes from Amazon. Amazon is working toward a carbon-free energy future, doing more with less, investing where it matters most, and supporting communities where we operate. Infrastructure Triage, the CFO's Q3 capital priority. Many finance teams entered 2026 with capital plans that assumed committed projects could still move on planned timelines. The infrastructure conditions that complicated those plans in Q2 are now the conditions Q3 begins with, and the portfolio decisions that follow are genuinely new territory. Infrastructure readiness spent the first half of 2026 moving from a strategic concern to a line item problem. Finance teams tracking it across energy, industrial, and facilities portfolios have largely stopped debating whether it matters and started confronting a harder question. When some of what was committed can't be executed on its original timeline, what actually changes in the capital plan? That shift in framing is the defining finance task at the start of Q3. The work is triage, identifying which projects in an active portfolio carry infrastructure dependencies that have become unreliable, which timelines need to be rebuilt against actual approval and delivery conditions, and which commitments can no longer be justified as originally structured. When infrastructure delays start changing, what a capital plan can actually deliver. The mechanism that turns an infrastructure delay into a finance problem is timing. When power delivery slips, or a permitting milestone extends by 6 to 12 months, a project's internal rate of return, IRR, assumptions come under pressure against cost of capital thresholds that were set under different conditions. McKinsey's Global Private Markets Report 2026 Infrastructure chapter tracks the broader market signal. The average age of infrastructure holdings not yet exited rose from 3.1 to 3.3 years in 2017 to 2022 to 3.5 to 3.8 years in 2023 and 2024, with liquidity pressure building as a result. The same report projects that energy and power infrastructure globally will require $23 trillion in investment through 2040, driven in part by U.S. power demand growth exceeding 3% annually. McKinsey names the execution challenges shaping that outlook directly: permitting bottlenecks, labor availability, supply chain, affordability, extreme weather, and resource adequacy. In practical terms, a project that delivers revenue 6 months later than modeled, against a capital cost that was set 12 months earlier, is a materially different investment than the one that cleared the approval stage. Those variances accumulate across a portfolio and tend to cluster in the same categories: projects with grid-side infrastructure dependencies, projects in regions with constrained interconnection queues, and projects that require permitting across multiple jurisdictions. Finance teams that haven't pressure-tested Q3 and Q4 project timelines against current infrastructure delivery conditions are carrying that exposure without naming it. The portfolio sorting problem. Finance teams are just starting to name. PwC's May 2026 U.S. Infrastructure Outlook puts the CFO's problem plainly. Finance and operating teams are managing complex, interdependent portfolios of new and existing assets that support growth, resilience, and decarbonization simultaneously, all while maintaining cost discipline and long-term asset performance. The competing capital priorities in the current cycle, data center investment, manufacturing reshoring, grid-dependent expansion, and energy system upgrades, don't resolve cleanly against a single set of infrastructure assumptions. Every project is reaching into the same constrained pool of grid capacity, permitting agency bandwidth, skilled labor, and critical equipment. PwC's Capital Allocation Maturity Framework identifies where this complexity surfaces most consequentially. Organizations at what the framework calls the established stage, where processes, roles, and systems are in place, but manual prioritization limits agility and responsiveness, are the most exposed in the current environment. They have enough process to believe they're managing their portfolios systematically, and not enough integration to see infrastructure dependencies accumulating across multiple simultaneous projects. The result is a planning model that looks orderly until an interconnection timeline slips or a permit doesn't clear, at which point the ripple across the rest of the portfolio is larger than anyone anticipated when the individual commitments were made. How competing capital demands are actually being weighted in 2026. The triage question, at its most practical, is sequencing. Given that infrastructure capacity and approval timelines aren't elastic, which projects in the portfolio have the strongest claim on conditions that actually exist? Which require infrastructure conditions unlikely to materialize on the modeled schedule? These aren't questions about which projects have the highest return potential. They're questions about execution feasibility under the conditions Q3 actually opens with. Organizations managing capital most effectively in this cycle are those that have connected capital strategy to frontline execution and built governance structures linking growth objectives to delivery plans with tighter scope control and performance accountability. That description fits a relatively small share of organizations. For those still operating on the assumption that approved capital deploys on approved timelines, the reckoning tends to arrive as a Q3 or Q4 variance explanation rather than a Q2 portfolio decision. The variance is the same either way. The cost of addressing it is not. What makes this cycle distinct from prior years isn't the existence of project delays. It's that the delays are now concentrated in infrastructure dependencies that sit outside any single organization's control. Utilities don't move faster because a capital commitment was made. Permitting agencies don't accelerate because a project has board approval. Those timelines are set by system conditions that a corporate finance function can account for, but can't manage directly. The questions CFOs should be asking before the next commitment. Effective capital triage in this environment starts with a specific review rather than a general one. The questions worth asking before the next commitment are concrete. Is the power delivery timeline tied to a queue position or interconnection agreement that actually exists, not one that's assumed? Is the permitting assumption based on recent precedent in the relevant jurisdiction or on timelines from a different regulatory environment? Has the team modeled IRR impact under a 6-month infrastructure delivery delay, specifically against current cost of capital? Projects that hold under those questions are executable under current conditions. Projects that don't are carrying embedded schedule risk that will surface as a variance explanation rather than a planning decision. The variance version is the more expensive one because the options for addressing it narrow after capital is committed. The finance function didn't create the infrastructure capacity conditions reshaping project execution in 2026. It is, however, the function best positioned to name them in portfolio terms, sequence capital around them before commitments are locked, and prevent the organization from absorbing costs that were never part of the original business case. Sustainability Soundbites Energy coverage is sponsored by Amazon. Visit the link in our show notes to learn more about Amazon's Spotlight on Energy. For sponsorship opportunities with Environment and Energy Leader, please reach out to a member of our team.